All right, so thank you everyone for joining me today. We're going to be looking at science at the TExES Science 4 through 8 review, and this is part 2. So we are going to be starting in the middle of the competencies, and we're going to be starting with life science. So today we'll be looking at life science and then earth and space science. So competency 11 relates to the teacher understanding the structure and function of living things. So as I was going through the competencies, what I realized is a great tool. I used to use Amoeba Sisters when I taught biology in high school. So if any of you have seen Amoeba Sisters, they have a YouTube channel and they've got like anything and everything biology related, and it's all tied directly to the TExES. So a lot of the videos I dropped in here are Amoeba Sisters because it's exactly what you need to do, okay? And some of it goes a little bit more in depth than you'll need for science 4 through 8, but those of you doing science 7 through 12 and you need biology review, it's like right on, okay? All right, so first thing we're going to review has to do with taxonomy. So when we talk about the term taxonomy, it's basically just a way of categorizing organisms, right? And it's related to like nomenclature so that it's the same no matter where we're talking about it, right? So there's going to be 8 categories, which are kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And this is going from like the biggest, broadest level of, I guess, way of categorizing things to a species, which is the most specific. Okay, so with kingdoms, right, I could have kingdom Animalia. And if I think about what belongs in kingdom Animalia, that could be my dog, that could be my cat, that could be me, that could be the mosquito that bit me outside, right? All of those things are going to belong in the kingdom Animalia. But if I go all the way down to species, right, and I'm talking about species, I could be talking about just like a human, right? Or just that whatever type of mosquito it was that bit me, right? So it's something super, super specific. Now, when we talk about organisms, we can also categorize them into domains. So there are 3 main domains, which are bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. And the way that we classify them all has to do with their cell structure. Okay, so if you don't know the difference between a eukaryote and a prokaryote, make sure that you do, look that up. So your prokaryotes are going to be bacteria and archaea, and the bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes, meaning they don't have a nucleus and they don't have organelles, and they're just very simple organisms. Some of probably like the most ancient organisms that we have here on Earth, right? Kind of what they believe everything kind of originated from. And then we have our eukaryotes, and eukaryotes are going to be cells like you, right? So that's kind of how they have you remember it. So prokaryote is no, so no nucleus. Eukaryotes are like you. So you have eukaryotic cells inside of you, which means that you have a nucleus and you have organelles. So our cells are more complex. They're going to also be a lot bigger than your prokaryotes. Okay, so eukaryotes could also include, your mushrooms or your plants, right? There's a whole bunch of different things that can be categorized by that. So those are the 3 main domains. But then we can further classify organisms into those main, oh my gosh, I want to say kingdoms. Yes, kingdoms. So for example, we have here Plantae, Animalia, fungi, Protista, Eubacteria, and Archaebacteria. So these are the 6 kingdoms that you do have to know. And you also have to know what their characteristics are. So you should be able to, if you're given an organism, you should be able to figure out which kingdom it belongs to. So Plantae is basically any type of plant, right? And how do I know it's a plant? Well, it's got to be green because it's got to do photosynthesis, okay? So those are your plants. So they're multicellular, they're eukaryotic, right? They've got those more complex cells. Animalia, multicellular, also eukaryotic. Your fungi, right? We think of like mushrooms and yeast. They're multicellular and eukaryotic, but they don't do photosynthesis, right? So that's kind of how those are different. So these ones are actually going to be heterotrophs, and they kind of, they'll decompose things, and that's what they eat. Your Protista is kind of like a catch-all type of kingdom. So they're eukaryotic, typically unicellular, right? Or they can be multicellular, but they're complex cells, but they don't quite fit in any of these kingdoms. So that's how they're considered that. And then your prokaryotes are going to be your eubacteria and your archaebacteria. Again, right, we're thinking like really simple cells, really, really small cells. They're both unicellular, both prokaryotic. And the difference between eubacteria and archaebacteria, when I see archae, I think ancient. I don't know, I guess they have the A and the C in there, right? So those are like your ancient types of bacteria that live in really extreme environments. So like in volcanoes or in vents, like in the bottom of the ocean. Okay, so that's our main kingdoms there. Okay, and then what I did also is I went ahead and I dropped videos in there so that you'll get the link for the YouTube. I'm sorry, you'll get the link for the YouTube video and you'll get the link for the Nearpod. So you can go back and look at the videos if you still have questions or want to see anything else in more depth. Okay, so the next thing you also have to know is how to use a dichotomous key. So on your note taker, it gives you a description of an organism, and then it gives you a dichotomous key at the bottom. So a dichotomous key is basically just, you always start at the top, and it'll always have an A and a B. And you're going to read both statements, and whatever statement the organism like fits, like whatever characteristic it fits, it's going to tell you to go to the next number. So let's say it says to go to 2, then you're going to read both statements on number 2, and then you'll just basically follow the path. Okay, so it's going to basically tell you how to get to, whatever it is, and eventually you'll come to a name of an organism. So I'm going to play this video because this one's going to show you how to do that dichotomous key.
So I actually have a dichotomous key right here. So like,
oh, awesome, for your animals. Okay, great, cool. I used to use them for my insects. I was categorized the insects. So yeah, I had a big book for that.
I have it for plants in this one.
Okay, cool. So for those of you that have never used a dichotomous key before, can you go ahead and try the one that's on the sample on the note taker, and in the chat, can you go ahead and type in what organism you get? So we are trying to classify. So I gave a description there of an organism, it's underlined, and then you're going to tell us which kingdom it belongs to. So just using the dichotomous key. Okay, and again, once you have your answer, just go ahead and drop it in the chat. I know I've got Hasel's got an answer in there. Okay, I've got mostly Protista. Does anybody have questions on how to use a dichotomous key? Nope, good. All right, so for this one, right, again, you always start at 1. So you read 1A and you read 1B. And based on what it tells you there, it says it's eukaryotic. So that means you're going to go all the way to 3. So you're going to completely skip 2. You're just going to look at 3. So read 3A, read 3B. And then it says it lives in water, right? Which is what it said in the description. So that means that it's got to be kingdom Protista, and that's it. You stop. So you're not going to read anything else. You're not going to go anywhere else. That's just where it ends. So if you get another organism, again, you just start from number 1. Okay. All right, so next off, when it comes to structure and function, you just have to understand that the structure is going to complement the function. And in your competencies, it says specifically in cells. Okay, so if you don't know what the names or functions of the cell organelles are, that's something that you're going to have to look up. Okay, so that's, you can find videos. I'm pretty sure I put a video in there from Amoeba Sisters. So whenever we talk about living systems, it's basically a self-organizing life form that interacts with its environment, maintained by flows of information, energy, and matter. Okay, so that's a living system. And so when we think of all living things, right, everything is going to be made up of cells. And so again, the structure is always going to complement the function. So it's got a certain look to it, a certain arrangement to it based on what its purpose is. So the example that I provided here is a cell membrane. So that is an organelle. It's what is on the outside of a cell. So it's like the whole, like, I guess you could think of it as like the boundary of the cell, right? Or like the border of the cell. And so cell membrane is semi-permeable, which means that it lets some things through, but it doesn't let other things through. So like really, really big things can't pass through it. But for example, water can. Okay, and it has to be that way so that the cells can, if they need water or if they need to, like let waste out or, whatever it may be, whatever their function is, they're going to be able to do that with that semi-permeable membrane. Another example is a vacuole. And so in this case here, I have a picture of again, diagram of what a cell would look like. Vacuoles in plant cells are going to be really large because they're used to store water. So plants, if they need water, it's not like they can walk to the water fountain and drink water, right? So their cells are built with large vacuoles so that they can store water for whenever it is that they need it, okay? And again, it has to do with that function, right? So in plant cells, they're going to be really, really large so that they can store a lot of water. Okay, and then again, yeah, so here's Amoeba Sisters, and it has all of the organelles. Talks about prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and then it goes through all the organelles as well as their functions. Okay, so if you don't know what any of those are, definitely come back, read that and jot down notes for it. Okay, then next thing has to do with levels of organization. So again, when I think of the organization of living organisms, it's always going to start with a cell, right? And then if I put a bunch of cells together, we get tissues. And if I put my tissues together, I get organs. I've got a bunch of organs together. I've got an organ system. All my organ systems are going to make an organism, right? So that's kind of going from super, super small up to, something big like me or like my dog, right? So that's just kind of the levels of organization. And then when we look at organisms, right, we also have to understand that organisms are going to require energy. And they'll also get matter, right? So where do they get their energy and where do they get their matter? So for example, if I'm going to be growing, right? I don't know, COVID, I was eating too much food, right? I got a little extra matter in me, right? And that came from eating. So with our organisms, right, we're going to have different types of organisms and they're all going to get their food and that energy from different sources. So the first example that we have here are producers, and you do have to know what all these terms are. So if you don't know what they are, make sure you jot them down, make a note. This is what I got to remember. So producers are typically going to be plants, although sometimes they can be certain protists. And basically it's just something that makes its own food, right? So a producer produces its own food. And it's typically going to do that by photosynthesis, although some organisms can do it by chemosynthesis. So they do it like by another means. It's a little bit different. But for the most part, producers are plants, P and P. And then your consumers are going to consume their food, right? So I had some students and they were really confused with the difference between producers and they couldn't determine the difference between heterotrophs and autotrophs. So producers are autotrophs, right? And that prefix auto means self. So an autotroph means that it gets its food from itself, right? It makes its own food. So my students were saying, but miss, I get my own food when I'm hungry. I can make myself a sandwich, right? So that's not what it means, right? It means that literally like inside your body, you make that food. So that's how your plants are going to do it. Okay, so producers, plants are autotrophs. Then your consumers are going to be organisms that consume something else. So they're literally going to eat something else. So for example, you all are consumers. You eat plants or you eat animals, you eat something, right, in order to obtain your energy. And then decomposers are typically bacteria or fungi, but they're going to eat dead, or not eat, but they're going to absorb, I guess you could say, dead and decaying matter. Okay, so all of these are going to play a role inside of food webs and food chains and all of that. And they're all interconnected. Okay, so next up we have your biomolecules. So these are the 4 main biomolecules. You do have to know what their main functions are, as well as what types it mentions their structure. And when typically in biology, when we talk about structure, we're talking about the types of elements that are found inside of them. So for carbohydrates, right, you've heard of lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins, right? We eat them, right? They're going to be found inside of our food. And they're all made up of different components, and they all kind of have different purposes, right, to why we need them in our diet. So carbohydrates, when you think of those in terms of food, right, it's your breads, your pastas, sugars, right? They're going to provide materials to build your cell membranes, and they're a quick energy source, right? So if I want to, I don't know, if I want to give my kids a little bit of energy, maybe I'm going to go sugar them up, right? Give them some candies. And then they're going to be all bouncing off the walls, right? And then they're going to have like a big crash, right? Like, oh, out of energy. So carbohydrates, they're a quick source of energy. Lipids, these are going to be a long-term energy source. And so if we eat too much, right, our body starts to store that energy in the form of fat. So we start to gain weight, right? And it's basically just storing it in case, for a rainy day, right? Hey, there's no more food, next week. So I'm just going to burn my fat that I have in my body. So that's the what your lipids do when it comes to eating, but they're also important in terms of insulating and cushioning your organs, and they're also required for cell membranes. Then your proteins, that would be like your meat, right? Your chicken, your beef. They're going to be important for structure, and they're also they're also enzymes. And then the last one are nucleic acids. So we typically don't hear about that when we eat it, right? But remember that nucleic acids are referring to DNA, right, which is genetic information. And in the nucleus of all cells, that's where we're going to find that DNA. So I guess technically we're always eating DNA from whatever organism it is that we're eating, right? Now, another note there, whenever we talk about something being organic, right, if we talk about it like at the grocery store, it's like, oh, I didn't use pesticides, right? But when we're talking about it in chemistry or in biology, organic just means that it has carbon. That's it. So organic is carbon and inorganic means no carbon. So when we look at the elements that are found in them, again, another Amoeba Sisters video here, on your chart there, the chart gives you the elements that are going to be found there. And so I would tell my students to memorize the order of the biomolecules. So I always put nucleic acids at the end because that's not something I eat, right? It's typically, we don't talk about nucleic acids in our food, right? But I would put carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins in alphabetical order. So carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. And then for my elements, it's cho, cho, chon, chomp. That's how I remember the elements. So cho, cho, chon, chomp, okay? And then in terms of the function, right, that's going to be, I don't know, figure out how to memorize that. But with your carbohydrates, right, I think of like my sugars, that's fast energy. Lipids is long-term. And then proteins, always refer to those enzymes. And then also for, what did I mention? I always forget that one. Structure, there we go, structure. Okay, so next off we have competency 12, and this one has to do, with reproduction. So when it comes to reproduction, there's going to be 2 ways that organisms can reproduce. So there's sexual reproduction or there's asexual reproduction. So when I have that A in front of any word, right, it means without. So basically without sex, right? So there's no sexual, anything going on for this type of reproduction. So when we look at different types of organisms, and we think of something that has to undergo sexual reproduction, it basically means that there has to be 2 people involved, right? It takes 2. So it's going to require 2 parents to form the offspring. And with sexual reproduction, you're going to have offspring that's going to be similar to the parent, but not identical. It's going to require some sort of fertilization. And when we think of plants, pollination is a form of fertilization. Okay, so for those of you that have allergies to plants, right, if you're allergic to all the pollen, I would tell my students, you're allergic to plant sperm, right? And they laugh, ha, 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 but that's how they remember that that's like sexual reproduction. Okay, so some of your plants, they need a mate, right? They need pollen from another plant in order to produce a seed. If they don't get it, then they're not gonna produce any seeds. So when it comes to asexual reproduction, it's only going to require one parent, and the offspring will be identical to the actual parent. So examples of that would be budding or even regeneration. So for example, starfish, when a starfish, if like an arm of a starfish breaks off, it can regenerate that leg, that whatever that arm is. And it basically just does it by, it's like cloning itself kind of. Okay, so asexual is kind of like, well, yeah, I guess I would say it's cloning. So your bacteria are going to do that, right? Some organisms do that, and the parents are identical to the offspring. Some similarities, right? They're going to produce offspring, obviously, and it all has to deal with some sort of genetic information. So that's being passed down. So with asexual reproduction, the genetic information passed from the parent to the offspring is identical. And in sexual reproduction, it's going to be a little bit different, right? You get a little from mom, you get a little from dad, we mix them up together, and that's how we get the child. And with sexual reproduction, this is actually a better way for fitness, a way to increase fitness for an organism, because there is, less likelihood of them, I don't know, dying from like the same thing. So like, for example, if there's like some pathogen, that an organism is, susceptible to being killed by, and it has offspring that are identical to it, then they're all going to be wiped out, right? But if they have different types of genes, then there's that chance of someone, right, or one of them surviving and passing on genes further on. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between the two. So it's better for organisms to reproduce sexually.
Yes, really quick, I had a question. So for asexual organisms, do they not evolve, or do they evolve slower than the other organisms?
So in terms of evolution, I'm not sure how to answer that question, because there could always be, and it always happens, there's always some sort of like mutations can happen just by chance. It's just something that happens, and that could be something that may cause a way for an organism to evolve. So I wouldn't say necessarily that they don't evolve, but I definitely, yeah, they probably don't evolve as fast as something that's going to reproduce sexually. All right, thanks, Asid. Okay, so then you also have to understand the organization of hereditary material, which is your DNA, right? So when I think of a cell, again, remember that cells that have a nucleus, inside of the nucleus is where you're going to find the DNA. So you have a nucleus is going to have chromosomes, and chromosomes are basically just wrapped up bits of DNA. I think of like yarn, like if you guys go and you buy the yarn, right, and it's all just kind of wound up, that's basically what a chromosome is. So it's just kind of wrapped up really neatly. And then if I were to unravel that piece of that bundle of yarn, right, I would end up with a long, long, long strand of DNA. And within that long strand of DNA, I can find genes. So genes are like a section of DNA on the chain, okay? So that's kind of that organization there. When I think of DNA, if I look at like specifically what DNA, it's basically made up of these 4 bases, and those 4 bases are what's going to determine anything, any sort of traits or characteristics for all living organisms. So we all have adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. It doesn't matter if I'm talking about an insect or a bacteria or, I don't know, a fungus, right? We all have the same bases. And so when it comes to genes and heredity, right, we want to understand that genes are only passed down from our gametes. So eggs and sperm, right, for those that do sexual reproduction, it's your gametes that are going to pass those genes down to the offspring. So for example, if I get skin cancer, right, on my hand, and then I have a baby, it doesn't mean that my baby's going to have skin cancer too, right? Because my gametes, my eggs weren't affected. So it would only be something that can be passed down from my gametes. And so some of your genes in these cells are going to be what's going to control certain traits. And sometimes it's like one gene that controls a trait. Sometimes it's multiple genes. It just kind of, depends on what we're talking about. So in terms of genes, you can have recessive genes or dominant genes. And a recessive gene it can only be expressed if there's 2 copies of that. So if you get one from mom, you get one from dad. That's how you'll see that recessive gene expressed. And then a dominant gene it'll be expressed as long as one of them is present. Let me see, okay. So ways that we can kind of come up with predictions as to what the offspring is going to look like is we use this thing called a Punnett Square. So on your papers, you have 2 Punnett Square examples. And basically what they do is you have like one parent on the top and one parent on the side. So again, we look at what possible genes the parent could have. And of course, this isn't like a automatic, oh, I know if I have 4 kids, 2 of them are going to look like this and 2 of them are going to look like that. It's more of just like a percentage. So it's going to say, well, there's this much percentage of my offspring coming out looking like that. And so with the Punnett squares, we use uppercase and lowercase letters to represent dominant and recessive genes. So dominant genes, right? The strong ones, the big ones, those are going to be my uppercase letters. Recessive genes are going to be the lowercase letters. So for example, in this case, I have a pea plant that is heterozygous, and I did not include that vocabulary term on there, but heterozygous, meaning that they're different. We have a dominant and a recessive gene. So one parent that's heterozygous for green pea pods. And then on this side, I have a parent that is homozygous recessive for yellow pea pods. So notice I didn't use a Y here, right? We're going to use only one letter, and that letter is going to typically be used to represent whatever the dominant gene is. So if I'm not talking about that dominant color, right, then I'm going to just use a lowercase letter. Then all you do is you just combine the letters into the boxes, right? Just combine them. And then looking at this, now I'm going to say, okay, in this case here, because I have a dominant gene, that means I'm going to have the color green, right? Green pea pods. Over here, also, I'm going to have an uppercase, so that's a green pea pod. And down here, because I have 2 recessive genes, then I'm going to get the color yellow. And same thing here. So if I look at this overall, there's a 50% chance of these 2 plants producing offspring that have green colored pea pods. And there's a 50% chance of them producing yellow ones. Okay, questions on that? No questions? All right, so I want you to go ahead and try this. So on your paper, you have 2 Punnett squares. And in that case, I am using the letter B. And uppercase B is representing brown eyes. So brown eyes are actually dominant. And I didn't even include that in there today. Yes, I did. So the uppercase is going to represent brown eyes. Lowercase b is going to represent blue eyes. So blue eyes are actually recessive to brown. So go ahead and try that first Punnett square. And then come up with a percentage. So what is that, the probability of having offspring with blue eyes in each scenario?
So you said as long as it's a dominant gene, it's going to be that trait, right?
Correct.
So like if you have brown eyes with blue eyes, then it's going to be brown eyes regardless of, okay.
Yes. And so again, just as a note, so the uppercase B is going to equal brown. Okay, so anytime you have an uppercase, that's brown. So what should it look like if I'm going to have blue? What do I have to see?
Lowercase.
Small b's.
2 small b's, yes. So I have to have 2 lowercase b's in order to see blue. Okay, so in the first one, we're looking for the probability of having blue eyes.
I also have a quick question. Like, for example, like right there, when it's 2 small b's for blue, right? It's always homozygous recessive.
Yes.
And it's always heterozygous when it's a big B, little b. And then there's no such thing as heterozygous dominant, right?
Homozygous dominant, yes.
Yeah, but no heterozygous.
Heterozygous, yeah. Yeah, so so the way I would teach my students the difference between hetero and homo, because you'll see it in different cases in biology. So, I would tell my students, okay, if you're homosexual, what does it mean? And of course your kids laugh, right? And then I'm like, homosexual means that you date that's all it means. You date the same sex. So homo means same, and then hetero, if you're heterosexual, you date a different sex. That's all. So homo same, hetero different.
Okay, yeah, just a quick reminder, because I don't know why, like I struggled with that last time I sat on a practice exam.
Yeah. All right. I got answers in the chat, and it looks like everybody said 0% chance of blue eyes in the first scenario, which is correct, right? I'm actually going to have 100% chance of the children having, or of the offspring having brown eyes. And then in the second example, everybody gave me 50% chance, which is correct as well. So we'll have a 50% chance of offspring having blue eyes. So that could be why my kids didn't get green eyes like my husband. My mom was so disappointed. Like if I did something wrong, like if I had control of it.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So like, let's say you have these 4 boxes, and then like, I don't know what they're actually called. Like the x-axis is one parent and the y is one parent.
Mhm.
Would those two, like, let's say you wanted to do something like hypothetically, would those represent your parents? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. So typically that's how they use it. Like, let me see, how do I erase this? So when I would teach this in class, gosh, there's gotta be an easier way to clear this. Okay. When I would teach this in class, you would typically have kids do like designer babies. That was like a lab that they would do. So you would say they have a, you know, you're going to pick this parent, you're going to pick that parent. Maybe they would, you know, I don't know, pick a movie star and pick some singer and you're going to put them together, right? And they come up with like their genetic combinations. And then you just do a bunch of Punnett squares. Okay, I'm going to do one for their eyes, one for their hair, one for their nose, one for their whatever. And so you can do that. Now, in reality, right, I don't know what genes I carry, right? I don't know if I carry dominant genes or recessive genes, you know. I'm thinking I probably carry dominant genes because my boys did not get green eyes, but you know, who knows? We don't know. So you can kind of have a kind of make a prediction of what you think the offspring will have. And so sometimes a lot of times this is going to be done with plants. So they'll already know like what the parents are, you know, because they'll like breed them a certain way, and then they can you know, breed the plants to be a certain way based on how they're mating them. Okay, so let me see.
Rice.
Okay, so just as a note, for like related to that video in terms of like modifying genes, right? They can't just take a corn plant that's already an adult and modify those genes, right? They have to modify them and so that the seed gets those genes. That's the only way it can be passed on. So just like I said, whenever we have genes that are going to be passed on to our offspring, it has to be from our gametes. So for plants, the you know, offspring cells are going to be the seeds, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and try these questions. Okay, so next up we have adaptations and evolution for organisms. So going back to our cells, when we, again, look at prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, pro is no, right? No nucleus. So prokaryotes are unicellular. Think super simple. They're very small. This picture is not to scale at all, okay? Eukaryotes are very, very large in comparison to prokaryotes. They're super, super tiny. And again, the examples will be bacteria. Eukaryotes can be unicellular or multicellular. They have a nucleus, right? There's my nucleus, and they're going to have organelles. So they'll have an endoplasmic reticulum. They'll have mitochondria. They'll have ribosomes. They'll have oh my gosh, Golgi apparatus, right? They'll have all sorts of different organelles in there. So they'll have different functions. Again, they're more complex cells. And so because of that, they're also going to be larger. Examples, plant cells, animal cells, protists, and fungi, okay? Again, more Amoeba Sisters. So when we talk about fitness and organisms, I know when I would think of fitness, I would think, man, you know, if you're really strong, then you're super fit, right? Like you're gonna survive. But when it comes to organisms, right, thinking of any organism out there, fitness means something else, right? Fitness basically just means that an organism is able to survive and reproduce. That's all it means. It doesn't mean you're strong. It doesn't mean you're faster. It doesn't mean you're bigger. It just means you survived and passed on your genes. That's it. So for some organisms, in order to increase their fitness, they just reproduce in super large numbers, right? Us as humans, we don't need to reproduce in large numbers. Like we're big organisms. We are, we're smart organisms, so we don't need to, right? So humans, we have one baby. It takes us 9 months to have that one baby. So aphids, they actually reproduce in huge numbers. Aphids, you can probably find them in your backyard. If you have plants, a lot of times they're on the underside of flowers and they look like just like little dots. I've seen yellow ones. I've seen red ones. I've seen white ones. There's all sorts of different, species of aphids, but they reproduce in huge, huge numbers. So something that I think is really cool. So aphids get eaten like super quick, right? Insects can come and just, it's not like one at a time. They eat like a whole bunch at a time. So they reproduce in such large numbers and they reproduce so quickly that like the female aphid could be pregnant with their baby, and inside of the baby, it's already pregnant with its baby. So that way, when they come out, right, they just like come out like really fast. So it's none of this 9 months thing, right? It's like super quick. If they reproduce in really large numbers, there's got to be a couple that survive, right, to reproduce, and that's how they're able to survive. Okay, some organisms are going to be, they're going to live in herds or packs, and they do that just so that they're able to, again, survive, right? If they're out on their own, they're more likely to be attacked and killed, right, by a predator. And so as zebras, for example, right, they're going to stay in those, they'll stay in their herds, and it just makes it harder for those predators to spot like one of them, to attack one of them. It's just kind of like this big mass, because once you see them all together, all the lines, they kind of blend in together. And then other organisms are going to have camouflage, which again, it's just a way to help them survive. So, all of these organisms, from my zebras to my aphids, they are fit, right? Because they're able to survive and reproduce, pass those genes on. So organisms, in order for them to survive, right, in order for them to increase their fitness, they have evolved over time and they have adapted to their environment. So, whatever it is that's gonna, help them survive, that's something that maybe certain things were not necessarily that they grew to be like that. It's more like the organisms that survived, right? They're the ones that passed on their genes. So cactus, for example, doesn't have leaves, right? Instead, it has those little spines, right? The little thorns or whatever on the cactus. Those are actually what the leaves would have been. But if a cactus had leaves, it would lose all of its water because there's going to be pores on it and all that. So it has evolved over time to just not have leaves. That's what it is. You've got these different animals here, right? So a giraffes, they didn't just grow, right? They didn't say, oh man, there's only food at the tops of the trees, I'm just going to grow a really long neck, right? It doesn't work that way. It's more like the animals that were able to eat that tall food, they survived and they passed on their genes. And so over time, you just kind of had animals with longer necks starting to grow because that's what the parents look like, okay? You've got your camels, right, that are able to store water so that they can survive like out in the deserts. And again, it's not something that happens from one generation to the next, right? So it's not like if a zebra gets moved, if a giraffe gets moved to like a zoo and now they don't have tall trees and now their food's on the floor, they're not going to say, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to have babies that have short necks, right? It doesn't happen that way. It's got to happen over a super, super long period of time. And that's really what evolution is. So you can have changes in populations over time, but you can't have a change in a population over like one day to the next, right? It's something that's going to take hundreds of years to happen. So they kind of change like in response to their environment. And again, it's just whoever survives is whoever passes on those genes. So because of evolution, right, we talk about evolution and it's not that, scientists say, oh, it's just a thing. It is because it is, right? There's actually evidence out there for evolution. So these are the main types of evidence for evolution that you do need to know about. So there's anatomy, embryology, the fossil record, and DNA. So we can actually look at all of these things and we can see that there's proof, right, that evolution happened over a long period of time. So when it comes to anatomy, there's going to be structures which are referred to as homologous structures, right? There's our prefix homo again, right? Same. So you have those same structures in different organisms, but they've been modified for whatever that organism needs them for. So for example, here I've got a bat wing, right? I've got a fin from a dolphin. I've got a human hand, a monkey's hand, right? And if I look at all of these, when you actually look at the anatomy of them and you actually look at the bones, they've all got the same bones in the same places. They're just different lengths, right? Or they've been modified for different reasons depending on what they need them for. So basically what that tells us is that we all have a common ancestor. So way back when, right, when you know, our ancestors were evolving, right, we all evolved from something in common. And that's why we all have these common bones, right, or that common anatomy. Embryology has to do with literally looking at embryos. So if you look at embryos of different animals, right, say I look at an embryo of a turtle, of a fish, of a dog, I don't know what, right? When you look at them as embryos and you look at them like super, super small, they all look the same. All of them look the same. And it's not until they start getting bigger that they start to look different. So us, for example, when we were embryos inside of our mom's, you know, bellies, we had a tail, right? And over time though, we don't need a tail. And so we, you know, we don't have tails, right? But if I were to look at how my dog looked, right? My dog starts with a tail, but they keep their tail because that's what that animal needed. So looking at embryology, again, that's just evidence for evolution. You can look at the fossil record and you can find fossils of organisms, right, that were relatives to organisms that are still alive. And you can see how they have also changed over time, maybe gotten bigger, maybe gotten smaller, maybe lost certain structures, right? Or maybe, you know, something was just a change and adapted for whatever they needed to survive. And then the last piece of evidence for evolution is DNA. So if you actually compare the DNA to any two organisms that are alive, the majority of the DNA is actually the same. There's actually a small piece of it that's different, and that's what makes all the organisms unique. But the majority of our DNA is the same, which again, just gives us evidence that we all came from some sort of common ancestor way, way, way back in the past. When we look back at our, I don't know, our family tree, our phylogeny. Okay, and then this one kind of talks about that. Sorry, not too much time to play videos. Okay, so number 14 has to do with mechanisms and behavior. And when we talk about behavior, we're also referring to stimuli. So a stimuli is just anything that causes a response in an organism. It could be internal, it could be external, right? So some of you may be tired right now, right? Some of you may be hungry right now. That's an internal stimulus inside of you that's telling you that. Some of you may be cold. I'm cold, my air conditioning's on, it's freezing in here. That's an external stimuli, right? And so my body is gonna respond to that. Your body's responding to that some way. And it responds to it because it's trying to maintain homeostasis. It's trying to maintain that balance that we need to be. So for example, our bodies, right, in terms of temperature for homeostasis, it's 98.6. That's where our temperature wants to be. So right now I'm cold. So what does my body start doing, right? I'm going to start to have goosebumps, right? My hair is going to start to stand up, and it's a way for my body to try to keep that heat in, right? We don't want to get too cold. When I get super, super cold, I start shivering, and it's just my body trying to get my temperature back to that 98.6. It's trying to keep me there. So that's what homeostasis is. And so anytime there is a stimulus to any organism, the organism is going to respond just to stay at homeostasis. And again, it's just to survive. Okay, so on this link, it just kind of talks a little bit more about homeostasis. So y'all can take a look at this one later. But if you did want like a resource, if you want to like read some information, TExES Gateway is something that is provided by TEA, and it's kind of like an online book. So you can go in there and you can see some of the different things that are in there if you want to look at, you know, some sort of text, but TExES Gateway is where you can access that. So on here, it kind of has a couple of videos that just kind of talk about stimuli. And then it also has some like sample questions and stuff that you can fill in. Okay, so when it comes to stimuli, there's also going to be these feedback mechanisms. So there's going to be like in your body, there's going to be certain things that are going to cause things to continue or cause things to stop once we get to that homeostasis level. So for example, when you eat food, right, your body is going to produce insulin so that it can break down that sugar. And then once you don't have any, you know, once it's broken down, then something in your body is going to say, stop producing insulin, right? So that's kind of what these feedback mechanisms are. So this video, I'm not going to play it because again, I know I'm not going to have enough time, but it's going to show you what feedback mechanisms are. So you do have to understand those. Okay, so with, let me see, oops, what the heck? That was the wrong slide there. Okay, so let's go ahead and try these questions. So with number 15, now we're looking at relationships between organisms and their environment. So organisms, there's always some sort of relationship between all organisms, right? Regardless of whether they are, all animals or all plants, right? We all are interacting with our environments. So this one kind of talks about the body systems, levels of organization, I think it was, and energy flow. And then when it comes to energy flow through ecosystems, we have to understand again that all organisms are depending on each other to meet their needs. So, even us, right, we depend on other organisms because we need food, right? We need to make sure that we have the fruits and vegetables and protein that we eat. So we're depending on other organisms to meet our needs. And then organisms are also going to depend on each other to reproduce and for protection. And when we think of a couple of organisms and how they're related to each other, we may be referring to like a food chain. So you have to know the difference between a food chain and a food web. So a food chain is just real simple, straightforward. It's just a couple of organisms, and you'll always start with the producer. So the producer will always be your plant. And again, the producer is what's going to have the most energy when we're looking at a food chain or a food web or a food pyramid. So in the producer has energy, and it gets its energy from the sun, right? The sun is the originator of all the energy. So the sun's energy is going to be given to the plant, right? The plants will make their food. And then in this case, the grasshopper is going to eat the plant. So the energy is going to move from the plant to the grasshopper. And that's why the arrow points to that organism. So it's not telling me what's doing the eating. It's telling me which direction the energy is flowing. Okay. So then again here, right, I've got this little mouse or whatever this is, and that's going to eat the grasshopper. So the energy is going to go to that one. The snake is going to eat this little guy here. So the energy is going to go to that one. And then this predator is going to eat the snake. So the energy is going to be flowing up. So again, here we have an example of a marine environment. So down here, we've probably got plankton down here. That's your producer in a marine environment. And then you're going to have this organism that's going to eat that eats that eats that, up until we get to our like apex predator. Okay, so then we can also look at food webs. So a food web shows a bunch of organisms, and it shows us how they are all related to each other. Okay, it shows us where all that energy is coming from. So again, typically on the bottom is where you're always going to have your producers. So I've got 3 different producers here. And you can see all the different organisms that eat each of those other organisms. So again, arrows are going to show the direction of the flow of energy. And again, my producers are getting their energy from the sun. So that's the originator of the energy. Now, when I look at this food web, this can also be used to determine what could happen to the populations, right? So let's say, for example, if I were to take something out, like let's say I were to take out this tree here, right? If all these trees died from disease, what would happen to my giraffes? You can unmute yourself. You can drop it in the chat. If all these trees died, what would happen to my giraffes? How would they be affected?
The giraffes would also die because they wouldn't have another organisms where they get their energy from.
Okay,
then
good.
The lion would die.
Okay, so I would have my giraffes that are going to die because they don't have any food to eat now, right? And my lions, maybe my lions wouldn't die, but maybe they'd start eating more of these rhinos, right? And now all of a sudden my rhinos are going to disappear. Maybe they're going to eat all the rhinos, right? That's going to affect everything else. So in a food web, that really gives us a better idea as to how all of these organisms are related to each other. And so if I throw something in, right, if I were to throw in some other organism in here, maybe I threw in something that, I don't know, that likes to eat grasshoppers. Maybe now we have too many organisms eating the grasshoppers, and all the grasshoppers are going to die, and it's going to affect everything else. So if you add something in or you take something out, it's going to affect everything that's in that food web.
Couldn't the giraffes like adapt and find something else to eat though? wouldn't that be another possibility, or is it automatically they're gonna die?
So in this case, if we're just looking specifically at like this food web, and in some cases that's the case, right? An organism may only eat one type of food. And so if that food is gone, then they have no other source of food. And so they're either going to leave or they're going to die out. But when we're looking at a food web like this, you only look at what's in the picture. You only use what's there. You don't assume anything outside or anything like that. But good question. Okay, so then I'm going to come back here. Okay, so we talk about, so you have to understand the food chains, food webs, and then we're going to watch this video, which is going to talk about food energy pyramids. Okay, so they're all related to each other in terms of energy. Okay, so when we look at populations, there's going to be a bunch of different things that can affect the size of populations. So right now we just kind of talked about a food web, right? And how if something, dies or something is, killed off or added, it can change the size of certain populations in there. So limiting factors are what's going to affect the size of populations growth, and they can be abiotic or biotic. So again, if I have that A in front, that A means without, and that prefix of bio means life, right? So non-living factors and then living factors. So abiotic factors could be the amount of water or shelter or just the temperature of the area that could influence the size of the population. If we have, so many plants or predators or mates, that can also affect size of a population. And so in some, in some areas, the amount of abiotic and biotic factors may only be able to support a certain amount of organisms. And if it goes beyond that, then it just can't support them, and it could be destroyed or whatnot. Okay, so limiting factors video. Okay. And then, so the next thing has to do with habitats as well as a niche. Okay, and this one, I believe on your guide, yeah, there's a place to fill in the habitat and the niche. I'm gonna play this. Okay, so on your paper, there is a place for you to describe a niche that seaweed has in a marine habitat, and then describe some possible adaptive characteristics that the seaweed has evolved due to its niche.
Wasn't that the finch thing? Wasn't that like a study in the Galapagos Islands by somebody that released a bunch of finches and was checking to see how they adapted?
Yes, so the video that I forgot to put in there, but I will put in there, has to do with Darwin and the finches. So is the father of evolution. That's what they refer to him as. And basically he was on a ship. He landed on the Galapagos Islands, and he saw these birds, right? And on the different islands, there were all of these finches, but they all had different beaks, and they were different sizes. And so he was able to determine, right, that maybe they all had a common ancestor, but because they lived in different areas, they evolved to adapt to their environment. And so that's why they all look different. But that is, that's that idea of natural selection and evolution. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and put you in a breakout room so that you can talk with your group a little bit, because I'm sure you guys are tired of listening to me. I was referring to this picture and I realized it was in the wrong place. My apologies, but let's go ahead and hear what y'all have to say. So let's hear from Valeria. Can you share with us, Valeria, what y'all labeled as your producers?
The big tree, the little tree, and the little plant.
All right, perfect. Okay, thank you. Let's see about the primary consumers. So let's hear from Michael. What did you all label as a primary consumer?
A giraffe, the grasshopper, and the little field mouse or whatever it is.
Okay, perfect. All right, primary consumer. And then how about secondary consumer? Alex.
So for that, I put the bird, and then I think it looks to be like a little lynx or something, the little cat thing. Yeah, we put those two.
Okay, perfect. And then a tertiary consumer, Rico.
I went with that leopard and the vulture.
This
That is-
leopard here.
Is that a leopard? Cheetah?
Okay.
Cat?
All right. Okay.
And then the little vulture.
This one right here. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So 1, 2, 3. Okay. All right. Great. So all of those are correct. And so if you'll notice for some of these, right, they could be more than one, right? Depending on what I'm looking at. So for example, if I'm looking at the vulture, for example, right, if I count from the producer up to the vulture, right, it could technically be a secondary consumer. It could be a 1, 2, 3, 4, a quaternary consumer, or it could be a tertiary 1, 2, 3, right? It all depends on where it is that we're counting. So, again, there is no one right answer when it comes to those. Great job, guys. All right, so next up, for our ecosystems. So when we think of ecosystems, again, they're gonna be evolving and changing over time, right? Everything is always changing. And so one type of change that we can talk about would be succession. So there's gonna be two different types of succession. There's primary succession and secondary succession. So the difference is that with primary succession, I'm literally starting with like rock, right? Maybe I'm starting off, maybe you have a volcano that's erupted and all we've got is the magma and rock and that's it, right? So that would be an example of where we would have primary succession. So with rock, you start out with rock and then you start to get these pioneer species such as moss. They're the first things that are going to start growing on the rock. And over time, a long period of time, they're going to start to break down that rock and they're going to start to turn it into soil. And once it has some soil, then you're going to have some seeds that could be blown in with the wind or by animals or something, and you'll start to have some plants. And over a long period of time, right, you'll have those rocks be broken down further. You'll have more soil there because of plants dying and whatnot, and you'll start to get, a big ecosystem that can evolve. So that's an example of primary succession. So you're starting from nothing and you're working your way all the way until you get to this big habitat, I guess that could be for all sorts of plants and animals. So the second type of succession is secondary succession. And this refers to an area that's already like a big ecosystem, right? It's got, it's got animals and plants and all sorts of organisms living in there, but something happens to it. Maybe there's a forest fire. Maybe there's a volcanic eruption. Maybe humans go in there and chop down all the trees, right? So if something like that happens, it's going to already have soil. And since it already has soil, it'll start to grow plants and all that much quicker. So secondary succession is going to happen a lot faster, but it's basically being destroyed by something, okay? And so the reason that primary takes so much longer is, again, we're starting with no soil. There's no soil whatsoever. It's just rocks.
Miss Hinojos, you're not showing the presentation.
Oh, darn. Okay. Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you.
All right, no worries. Okay. All right. So let's try these questions. All right, so next off we have Earth and space science. So I'll tell you for this one, there was like a ton of information. So I have a ton of videos in there, so you can go back and take a look at them later as well. So for the first part, the first couple of them, it's just looking at Earth systems. So you do have to know the layers of the Earth, right? The layers of the, so you have the crust, the mantle and core and all that stuff. And understand that the surface of the Earth is going to be shaped by constructive and destructive processes. So on the next video, it's going to show a video about landforms and how they're formed. You do also have to know what the atmosphere is made of. So there are different layers of the atmosphere, and you have to know like what can happen, what types of gases are found in there as well. Okay, so when we talk about landforms are just natural physical features that are found on Earth, and they're described typically by what they look like and where they're found. So examples would be oceans, rivers, valleys, plains, plateaus, mountains, right? Those are all landforms. And again, they're created by constructive forces such as volcanoes or tectonic plate activity, or destructive forces such as weathering or erosion. Okay, so all of those things are what's going to form, you know, what's on the surface of the planet. Okay, so I realized my video is not there for my landforms. I have to find that. Okay, so this next one has to do with reading the topography. I could not remember how to do this, so I did find the video that shows how to do that, but it's like those maps where you can see all the lines, right? And it's going to tell you, you know, maybe like if you're hiking, right, you know, if you're going to be coming across a mountain or a hill or a cliff or something. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. Okay, so on Earth, we are going to have different types of water. So in your competencies, it mentions specifically watersheds and aquifers. So surface water is basically any water that's out on the surface, right? Lakes, rivers, oceans, streams. And a watershed is just an area of land that captures that rain or snow. So it's like a big area, and you know where it rains, it's just going to capture that water. So there may be surface water that's found on it, or it may be capturing the water and it could be sending it to like an aquifer, which would be underneath, right? So that would be like groundwater. So in an aquifer, there's basically, you know, there could be spaces underground where water can collect. It could be between rocks, you know, it could be just, you know, underground, but they're all replenishing each other. So in this diagram, it kind of shows you how, water basically, it has like a certain level. And so if, for example, like you have this spring here, if the spring starts, you know, I don't know, if you go and you start pulling water out of there, there is groundwater in there that can replenish it. So it won't like, you know, you won't just like completely deplete it, because there is like a water level that exists there. So again, there are aquifers, which will be the underground, and then a watershed would be like this whole area. So this whole area would be considered a watershed, because if it rains or snows or anything, it's going to capture the water within there. Okay, and then I put a link there, and it just kind of talks a little bit more about watersheds and aquifers if you wanted more information. So then when it comes to the atmosphere is just a mixture of gases that surround the Earth. There is an order, right, to them. So you do have to know the order from the, you know, either from the outside in or inside out. So exo, again, that prefix exo is going to mean out, right, or exiting, right? I think of exiting like leaving out. So that's going to be the last layer. So you have the exosphere, thermosphere, mesosphere, stratosphere, and troposphere. And again, on the next video, you can watch that later. It's going to show you like what happens. So like the space station is going to be orbiting in the exosphere, right? And we're going to be living in the troposphere. So at each layer is also going to have different temperatures depending on where it's located, just because of, you know, whether it's like within the atmosphere, or if it's being exposed to the outside with the sun, or, you know, where the ozone layer is and all that.
Ms. Hinojos, I think the space station is in the thermosphere.
Thermosphere, really? Oh my God. Let's say I watched a video yesterday.
Satellites are on the exosphere, and the space station is in the thermosphere.
Okay, thank you, Cessa. My video was wrong. All right. Okay, so when we talk about Earth's spheres, it's sometimes referred to, I saw it was referred to as Earth spheres or as Earth systems. So there are 4 of them. So there's the geosphere, which has to do with the non-living parts on Earth, such as rocks and soil, right? I think of like geology, right? Geosphere. Biosphere is going to refer to all of the living organisms or living parts on Earth's surface, such as the plants and animals. The hydrosphere, hydro, right, is referring to the water. and then the atmosphere, which would be referring to the gases. So all four of these are part of what makes up Earth, and they all interact with each other, right? They can't, like, it's not like one can exist without the other. They're all, they all play a role in the planet. Okay, and then, all right. And then, so when it comes to Earth, right, there are a whole bunch of energy aside from like the sun, right? So these are different types of energy that you do have to know about. So solar energy, obviously obtained from the sun. Geothermal, that is coming from energy from the heat on the inside of the Earth. Wind, you can have like your windmills to capture that one, right? The movement of the air in the atmosphere. Hydroelectric is like at dams, that's how they produce that one. And then biofuels, so that's from biomass such as plants or animal waste, and that's how they make fuel out of that one. So those are just different sources of energy. Okay. So then the next one has to do with cycles. So there's like a billion different cycles. So the rock cycle is the first one. So you do have to know the rock cycle. There are basically the three main types of rocks. So there's, so magma is kind of what starts everything, right? And once the magma crystallizes, it's going to form igneous rocks. So igneous rocks is the first type. And then igneous rocks can be broken down. So like, for example, can break it down and it turns it into these sediments, right? So like really small bits of rock. And those sediments will be, you know, maybe they'll be, you know, carried down and on the ground, carried down in water, wherever. But those sediments are going to be compacted together and they're going to form sedimentary rock. And then through metamorphism, through like extreme pressures, extreme temperatures, you're going to have metamorphic rock that can be evolved. And they kind of all change, you know, from one to the other. You do have to know examples of each of these, like common examples. And there they are. So igneous rocks, again, it's basically just the solidification of magma. So like it just crystallizes, right? So magma is like a liquid. And then once it turns into that solid, it's igneous rock. So common examples are basalt, pumice, and granite. Sedimentary examples would be sandstone, limestone, and shale. And since sedimentary rock is formed from like small little granules of rock, like lots of little bits and pieces, it also is very brittle. So sedimentary rock can be broken really easily. Like you can crack it easily with your hands. And then metamorphic rocks, again, they have to be exposed to either high heat or high pressure or to a hot mineral-rich fluid or exposed to all three. And then that's how it forms those rocks. So a common example would be gneiss, slate, and marble. And then there is a video that shows the rock cycle. And then a video that shows how sedimentary rock, I believe it's sedimentary, how it's related to fossil fuels. There we go. Okay, let me go back to this. I think it's a carbon set. Okay, so then there are the different cycles. So there is the water cycle that you do have to know. And so you have to know how the water is like, you know, I guess kind of like recycled, right, from one stage to the other. But you also have to know what the names of them are, right? So like when it comes from the clouds, right, it rains, that's like precipitation. You know, when it goes from like a liquid to a gas, what is that? Condensation is gas to a liquid. Yeah, so you have to know what all those different names are. So this one is going to go through the carbon and the nitrogen cycle, which are also important cycles.
So last weekend, my family bought something pretty cool. Something I'm sure that you've always wanted. No, it's not a pony.
Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and try these ones. Okay, so this next one has to do with weather and climate. And I think these last couple ones, 19 and 20, I think are pretty simple. So when it comes to weather, you do have to know what weather is composed of, what the components are. So temperature, atmospheric pressure, wind, humidity, precipitation. You have to know what they are, and you have to know how they're measured. Okay, so I put the instruments are there. And then you do have to know the difference between weather versus climate. So I saw it on one of the videos. They kind of talked about how weather, when you think of weather, it's basically like what you're going to wear that day, but climate is more of what you're going to have in your closet, right? So we live in the desert, but today, for example, it was cold, right? So maybe I wore a sweater today. So the weather was cold. It's a short-term condition. But the climate, I live in the desert, so I actually don't have like a big winter coat, right? I've got a lot of like really light things because that's the climate. It's pretty much always warm here. Okay. And then this one shows how to read like a weather, is it a weather map? So like when you watch the news and they have the H's and all that stuff. I'm still learning that too. So this is just kind of talk about that.
This is Dwayne Friend with University of Illinois Extension. You want to see what the weather is going to be?
Okay, and then this one basically shows you the cycles of the moon. So you do have to know the cycles of the moon. That was something I could never remember. But after I saw this video, I was like, oh, okay, I can remember how to do that from now on. So it's basically just a demonstration. She just kind of shows you how to, it's like a demo that you could do yourself, just so you could see what they look like. So I am going to play this one. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you got a lot of information. I will be sharing the Nearpod with you. So I just need to add in those couple of things. So I'll share it with you once I have that done. And then you have that note taker so you can, go back on this at your own time and fill that in and add any other information so you have something to study off of. And that's about it. So thank you everyone for coming.